Welcome everyone. Giving folks just a minute here to hop on and then we'll kick things off. All right. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the webinar today, From Guidance to Action, Accelerating Fleet Electrification, co-hosted by Ceres, We Mean Business Coalition, and Climate Group. We're really excited that you could join us today. My name is Brandon Jones. I'm the Senior Manager of Electric Vehicles with Ceres and am joined by co-hosts Santari Palamaki and Richard Parker, representing We Mean Business Coalition and Climate Group, respectively. Um, a few quick notes at the top. Our webinar today will be recorded and shared with all attendees. And we have the Q&A feature is open and active, and we encourage all participants to add their questions there throughout the webinar, and we will address the questions during the Q&A section at the end of the session. If you need closed captioning during this webinar, please select the CC button or closed captioning button on the Zoom toolbar, as we have made sure that that is enabled today. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Santeri to give an overview of the session and our agenda. So take it away, Santeri.
Thank you very much, Brandon. And hello, everyone. I'm Santari Palamaki, Senior Manager for Industry and Transport at the We Mean Business Coalition. On today's agenda, we will introduce two guidance documents, Ceres Driving Growth Report, as well as We Mean Business Coalition's Business Action Checklist. After that, we'll continue on to a great panel discussion with our esteemed panelists today. And as Brandon already mentioned, we will have some time for Q&A at the end. So please do add those questions through the Q&A. Back to you, Brandon.
Thanks so much, Santeri. All right. So Santeri and I are going to start things by just giving a quick intro of some guidance reports that have come out on fleet electrification from Ceres and We Mean Business Coalition to help set the stage for the conversation today. All right, and you can move to the next slide here. Great, thank you. So last December, in partnership with We Mean Business Coalition, Ceres released the report Driving Growth, Managing Transition Risks in Transportation for Investors and Companies, which outlines the physical, financial, and market transition risks and opportunities that climate change creates for the transportation sector. Importantly, and most relevant for our conversation today, the report also provides strategic recommendations and case studies for companies seeking to capitalize on market transitions in the transportation industry. We'll hear about such recommendations and case studies soon from my colleagues at We Mean Business and during the fleet panel. So for my part, I just want to help set the stage by outlining some of the key market principles that undergird our report's recommendations. And these principles are threefold. So first, even after adjusting for recent regulatory rollbacks in the US and elsewhere, transportation market data analysis and future outlooks from outlets such as Bloomberg NEF and the International Energy Agency continue to demonstrate and project strong global growth trends for clean vehicles. Second, planning for the future by complying with more stringent transportation emissions regulations, even if current local or national regulations where a company operates are less stringent, still constitutes better risk management practice and positions companies to capture greater long-term value and competitive advantages. And third, zero emission technologies will only continue to gain a relative cost advantage over their fossil fuel driven counterparts, both in terms of capital expenses and upfront costs, as battery manufacturing costs continue to decline, and operationally, as electricity markets maintain superior cost stability over fossil fuel markets, a long held tenet whose veracity is only punctuated by the ongoing conflict in Iran. I'll close my overview of our recent report there, but really encourage attendees to check out the full report on Ceres' website. And with that, I'll pass things back to Santeri to discuss the transportation guidance provided in We Mean Business Coalition's Business Action Checklist. So back to you, Santeri.
Thank you very much, Brandon. So as the name of our organization suggests, we are a coalition of 7 business-minded NGOs, helping progressive businesses such as yourselves in the audience to transition from fossil fuel solutions to clean solutions. Ceres and Climate Group are both founding partners of the Women Business Coalition, and we wanted to produce a way to get started and a guidance document that any company of different size or different industry can take up and learn sort of where to get started to scale clean solutions. This guidance document does not only focus on transport. We also have guidance on energy efficiency in buildings, electricity procurement, and process heat. But the one that's the most interest for you is the transport section, which includes guidance on fleet management, third-party logistics, and also business travel. Within the guidance document, you can find decision-making flowcharts to help you get started and follow the steps to actions and investments that help you scale clean solutions. We have also included case examples for inspiration, companies that have already made investments across these 4 areas to provide you with inspiration on how to get started. So, dear audience, if you have colleagues who are focused on transport, whether they're focused on electricity procurement, buildings, or process heat, you can share these with them or your suppliers who might be interested in the topic. And also to those of you who have operations outside of the US, for example, in India, we're also planning to launch our India edition of the Business Action Checklist on the 28th of May. But without further ado, I'll pass it on to our colleague, Ricky Parker from Climate Group's EV100 to introduce our panelists, many of whom include companies that are already taking steps in this transition and can share you their practices and experiences so far. Over to you, Ricky.
Great. Thank you, Santeri, and thanks you all for being here. So again, today's conversation is about guidance to action. And so Women Business Series has some great guidance tools, and now we're going to hear a little bit about some of the action that folks are taking. So again, I'm here on behalf of Climate Group and EV100. EV100 is a global campaign of companies who committed to electrification of their fleets. So they are both on their own journey to pull that off, but also work together to share knowledge, to advocate for policies, to drive demand for these EVs, to lower the cost and make these vehicles more accessible to everybody. We are publishing our annual report shortly, and I'm happy to tease here a couple of the key stats from that upcoming annual report about some of the progress our members have made over the last year. We have over 100 companies in the campaign, representing over 140 markets and 1.7 million vehicles committed globally. Nearly 500,000 BEVs have been deployed on the roads now, and 48,000 charging units have been installed. And so we're going to hear today from just 2 of those companies. We are happy to have Josh Green from Inspiration Mobility, which is an EV-first fleet management company. And so he can speak to the hundreds of fleets that they have worked with and the progress that they have seen. And then we're also happy to have Kristen Borsetti from AstraZeneca, who has done really impressive work with their sales fleet in the US and learned some of the lessons that AstraZeneca has learned along the way for their good progress. So over to them to hear more about the work they've done to date.
Great. Thank you, Ricky. Great to be here. Excited to speak with everybody about guidance to action, because that's what we do here at Inspiration Fleet, helping fleets actually seize the electrification opportunities they have in front of them. So I have a few quick slides here. Starting off with the provocative question of what's stopping you. And we're going to get into what fleets can do and why many fleets are moving pretty slowly on this. So first, I want to start by talking about the common EV narrative. Everybody has been, I'm sure, hearing skepticism about electric vehicles and where and when they fit and why that's wrong. So no doubt we're in an EV negative moment. Naysayers are finding a lot of support when not the least from the US government and other sources, when looking at the loss of government incentives, OEMs pulling out of the market or delaying the introduction of new models. So things you might hear and that might be resonating inside your company. EVs are still too expensive. Charging is not ready. Range can be a deal breaker and won't work for us. Drivers don't want EVs. Each one of those, there are pieces of that are true in a given fleet or a given application. But in 5+ years of doing this and speaking with and working with hundreds of fleets, we have yet to find a fleet that doesn't have clear, profitable, and viable electrification opportunities ready on the table, waiting to be implemented. And so what we do, and the question that we really want to talk about today is what is holding back electrification progress? Why are fleets not moving more quickly? So if we go to the next slide, what's real? Let's talk a little bit about some of the myths that are out there and fact versus fiction. So first fiction is upfront costs. Brandon alluded to this, the price declines of batteries and the fact that in actuality, the upfront cost premium of electric vehicles is coming down so quickly that in many segments, it's actually almost gone completely. And the fact is that the vastly lower fuel and maintenance costs, even with a cost premium that continues to diminish, still delivers a lower total cost of ownership. So there are many vehicles, most vehicles in quite a few fleets, where EVs are actually cheaper and more affordable. Second is charging infrastructure. We often hear, well, charging infrastructure is too scarce, it's too complex or costly. I was at a fleet conference last week where people said, well, I heard they're stopping building public charging, so we're just going to wait until that's sorted. The fact of the matter is the range of charging options has never been greater, and the vast majority of fleet vehicles can do their jobs on a very simple to install overnight level 2 charge. So locating those is not usually the barrier. Driver behavior. We hear often, oh, my fleet drivers don't want an EV. They're concerned, they don't like EVs. But the fact is, if you vet those drivers correctly and put them in the right application with the right EV, the vast majority of EV drivers, over 96% in a recent JD Power study, would never go back to an ICE vehicle. So EVs work when done right. Similar with range anxiety, people talk about EVs can't handle the load. It's about matching the right EV with the right charging with the right route, and doing that, even taking into account payload, climate adjusted range. So again, data fixes that problem. And grid capacity. Occasionally, we will hear from customers, well, I'm worried that I'm gonna jack up my utility rates for my electricity, or we won't be able to build charging. And the fact of the matter is that not when it's done right. There's minimal disruption both to electricity cost and to sites when using overnight level 2 charging, which is viable for the majority of vehicles, fleet vehicles. And in addition, if you take advantage of all the incentives that are out there, time of use rates, and smart charging technology, grid capacity is really not a factor for anything other than heavy duty depots. So moving to the next slide, it's true, not every fleet can go fully electric today. In fact, I'd say very few fleets can go fully electric today, but every fleet can start, and there's more room to go electric than most people think. Every fleet has unexploited opportunities to deploy EVs that will save them money. Fleet electrification isn't an all or nothing exercise, so it's important about where you start and what you do. Selecting the right partner that has a proven approach, the right team, and even can guarantee results is critical to success. And then lastly, pilots fail when they're not well designed and regularly monitored with the right stakeholders. We actually are often brought in to conversations because a pilot has failed, and we start engaging with the fleet, and we ask, well, how did that pilot go? And they're like, I'm not even sure how it went. I don't know how to quantify that. I'm not sure how to discuss that with the rest of my team. So what we see over and over as the key takeaway here, and something that I talk about every time I'm on stage in every webinar, is that the biggest barrier to fleet electrification is not any of these risks. It's really corporate inertia, including procurement, which often gets held up on processes that were designed for ICE vehicles, and the perception that anything new is risky. And it's often a culture change that's needed to begin successful electrification. So if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about success stories, what we've seen be successful and where. We work with one of our customers is a 6,000 unit national facility services provider. They've got mostly vans and pickup trucks in their fleet. We started with an initial 40 electric vehicle pilot. These are bright drop vans that were upfit for their needs. They're saving between $9,000 and $10,000 per vehicle and reducing emissions, 7 million metric tons of CO2, 7 metric tons, excuse me, and seeing great results. And we are now looking for areas to deploy more EVs in that fleet. Likewise, we work with a 3,300 unit taxi fleet across the country, one of the largest operator of taxis in the country. They're closing in on 100 EVs in multiple locations. They've saved 84,000 gallons of gas. They're seeing 40% lower operating costs relative to the ICE vehicles. And for them, we actually built dedicated high-speed charging hubs because those vehicles are highly utilized, and in level 2 overnight charge is not sufficient given the miles they do. And so we've hosted 22,000, almost 23,000 charging sessions at those hubs, which also drive revenue for the taxi company. And another example that we are working with now, 2,000 unit automotive parts distributor. This is interesting because, as I mentioned, a failed EV pilot. They started an EV pilot with 50 EVs. It was poorly designed, and 49 of those were put in locations that ultimately didn't have readily accessible charging, and so those EVs are not even operating. And yet the one EV they have operating on charging is the best performing vehicle in their fleet. And they brought us in and said, help us get those 49 EVs operating so we can replicate those results and then scale this throughout the company. So lastly, if we just go to the next slide, my advice for fleets and fleet managers and procurement arms is really just don't take no for an answer. Like, there's always a place to start. And when we do an analysis that we call our EV opportunity assessment to see how many vehicles and routes should be electric today based on today's technology, today's cost of charging, we usually find over 50% of the fleet should be electric. And so keys to getting this right are doing the analysis, getting the data, and letting your own operational data, customer driver input tell you the real story, asking the right questions. So that's something we're increasingly being asked to come in and help companies rewrite RFPs for the electric era. Make sure you're asking questions that are relevant in an EV world. Optimizing the system for success. Electrification is a systems integration problem, ultimately. It's not about a like-for-like vehicle swap. It is about which vehicle, which route, which charger, which utility rate, which incentive. So putting those things together in the system is the key to success. Picking the right partner. Technology is only as good as the team behind it. And so there are partners, there are teams that are obvious experts in this, and there are others that learn on your dime. So picking the right partner is critical. And then measuring and validation. Defining the KPIs up front, having a technology interface that allows you to integrate data from multiple sources and run the analyses you want, so that performance data can be used to build the case for more EVs and show, if there are problems, where those problems are and how to solve them. So that's what we've seen from working with hundreds of fleets. And with that, I will pass it over to Kristen from AstraZeneca, which is a fleet that's had a lot of success in this area.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks, Josh. Yes, I am here to represent our journey to an electric fleet. We have a very large sales force that covers all corners of the United States. And I'm here to report that we are nearly fully electric. And when I was putting these slides together, we started this journey a few years ago. I led this project. Josh, happy to report I am in our procurement function. So we were very much embracing this. And I really tried to stop and think, like, what do I wish I knew at the start of our journey to make us more successful quicker? And that is what I tried to focus on. So we could go to the next slide. Yep. So really just want to talk about kind of what was our commitment, what was our journey, the challenges and the learnings, and then what are for the approximately 2% of our fleet that are deferred past last year, which was our deadline to meet a fully electric fleet where possible. What are those categories? Okay. All right. So our very kind of large global commitment was that by the end of 2025, AstraZeneca would be an all-electric fleet where feasible. And our journey was, quite an experience. So these are just some sort of key points to kind of speak to what we had to overcome in the kind of start and the inception of this change journey in 2021 through 2025. So at the very start of our journey, which was right kind of during COVID, we had massive supply chain constraints. We were only able to offer one electric vehicle option. Today, we're able to offer 6. The range has increased by over 100 miles, and it really has helped that the sales force likes choice. They don't like being told, kind of one vehicle. They like choice. So that was a massive hurdle that we were able to overcome. Infrastructure. AstraZeneca will pay for chargers in somebody's home. We have also, and I'll speak to this in a little bit, set up a program where we will also work to influence property managers where an individual maybe does not own their primary residence. So as of today, we've actually installed nearly 6,000 chargers in people's residence. We've had to completely update our policies and processes. So how are we reimbursing our employees, and what is the process to ensure that we're reimbursing for the electricity that they use to charge their vehicle? We've had to really dive deep into our data to make sure that we've got a data-driven approach to both who at what time went into an EV, how we kind of inform and make decisions on people coming and saying, I want a longer range EV, because we're constantly, introducing longer range EVs to our fleet, and more. Just, the fleet change doesn't stop with the fleet. It obviously does have a trickle down effect. Change management. This is the piece that AstraZeneca was probably the most proud of. We invested heavily in education and change management. So we actually contracted with an EV expert who would do one-on-ones or personalized kind of journey planning sessions. We held nearly 200 personalized journey planning sessions. We created a plethora of education materials that have had 70,000 views, which tells us that our drivers are going back over and over again. We've had education kind of large webinars that were reaching 1 to 2,000 drivers at a time. So again, this was sort of where these were not our early adopters, right? These were people that were being moved to an EV because it was the direction that AstraZeneca was going from a values perspective, but not necessarily because these drivers were at the forefront, excited to adopt this new technology. So we really, really had to help them along on their journey. And then the last thing, which it sounds maybe soft, but it was really a pivotal change, was shifting the goals that we had year on year with, again, that endpoint of 2025, and shifting those goals from our centralized EV transition team to our leaders who actually owned kind of the objectives and the individuals. And that really, from an accountability perspective, was huge. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so here are some of the key challenges that we encountered and how we addressed them and what we learned. So influence and accountability. I just sort of ended on that. But as I mentioned, a paramount shift in leader accountability when the targets were shifted from our team to their targets. So we went, to the very, very top to say, we want EV targets for each team embedded in their objectives. They have to have, these are their team members who, at the end of the day, if they don't have a stake in this game, then we are not going to be successful. So a massive shift in accountability there, and a really positive shift for our program. Leveraging data to define EV readiness. So when we started at the beginning with what we called a learning launch. So we did not start with a pilot because this wasn't about, hey, is it going to go well? And if it does, we'll do it. If it doesn't, then we'll pause. We were doing this. We had made a commitment. So we had started with some volunteers that we said, okay, we're not going to pilot this, but we do want to start with some volunteers that we're going to learn from. But we were finding that we were tapping out of our volunteers. So what we did was really dig into the data to say, okay, how many miles? We do not have telematics at AstraZeneca on our vehicles, but we were able to use a very accurate monthly mileage from our drivers and get a conservative daily mileage driven. And that correlated to what we called an EV readiness score. And what we found that it was the data really helped us be a myth buster on who was EV ready. We actually learned that some of our largest territories were actually most prime to go and pivot to EVs, where we would have thought, for those that were coming and saying, oh, I'll never be successful in EV, my territory is huge. Well, it turns out that when your territory is so big, sometimes you fly. If you're a leader and you carry a really large territory, you might actually be driving to your teammates and doing field rides with them. So we actually looked at, what is their actual driving habits, not what are they saying their driving habits are. And our data accounted for range degradation, temperature, terrain, et cetera. So we took a really conservative approach. So when somebody would come back and say, okay, you can't tell me exactly, I don't have a perfectly uniform kind of daily driving pattern, we would say, yes, we know that. And that was built into the data. That was built into the assumptions of the data. So we were able to constantly ground ourselves in that. And it allowed us to kind of come out ahead of some really, really difficult conversations. Addressing our population of drivers who rent their residence, and therefore installing a charger wasn't their sole kind of decision, right? So this was probably the biggest challenge that loomed over us at the start of the process. So two solutions were identified. We stood up a program where we really worked to invest in installing chargers at these rental properties. We set up with our third parties, who would answer questions, how we would instill that confidence, how we would contact these rental properties. And then for those property managers who came back and said, yes, AstraZeneca put our money where our mouth is, and we did invest there. And where they said, no, we then looked at adequate public charging and had defined what we considered to be adequate public charging, where somebody could rely solely on public charging. And if they had that and they could not get a charger installed, they were still transitioned to an electric vehicle and would rely on public charging. And then defining and managing deferral categories. So every driver, of course, has a unique situation, but defining a set of principles really allowed us to kind of cut through all of the nuance and really understand these very kind of basic deferral categories. And at the end, only about 2% of our drivers did not transition to EVs at the end of next year. And in addition, we never used the word an EV exception. We only used the word a deferral because all deferrals are temporary until the circumstances can meet their needs. So we do review those 2% semi-annually. And if circumstances change, either with infrastructure, they move, we get larger EVs that can help some of our ergonomic and medical deferrals, then they will be transitioned to an electric vehicle. And we can go to the last slide. Great. So these are our approved deferral categories. So either this first one's a very, very, very small population, but the data shows they're not EV ready. They actually drive above and beyond the range that we have in our fleet at the time. We've got third parties that we work with who kind of are independently validating whether the driver has an ergonomic or medical deferral that would prohibit them from moving to an electric vehicle at this time. That's probably, to be honest, our second largest, and our largest is probably these renters without good public charging infrastructure. So people who we have confirmed do not own their property and who do not have good public charging infrastructure. And then the last is just more of an HR, lens that obviously we cannot contact somebody and start any transition if they're on LOA. And when you're dealing with such a large fleet, there's always going to be a percentage that, are on LOA, which equals a small population of the drivers. And that's it from an AstraZeneca perspective. So I believe, Brandon, I'm throwing it right back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kristen, and to Josh as well for these great presentations. And just a reminder to folks that you will have a chance to ask any questions of Josh and Kristen at the end. So feel free to drop any questions for the panelists as we go into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address those at the end. Great. And so I'm very excited to introduce our final speaker today, Nate Lapides, Senior Manager of Climate and Energy with United Natural Foods, Inc., or UNFI. UNFI is a valuable member of Ceres' Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance, or CEVA. CEVA shares a similar mission with our colleagues at EV100, focusing specifically on advancing commercial fleet electrification in the United States. We are a group of 32 major companies working together to share best practices and identify and solve current market, technology, and policy hurdles at the state and federal levels. So with that intro, and you can see our company makeup for CEVA here. But with that, I'm going to pass things over to Nate to talk about the great work that UNFI is doing.
Great. Thank you, Brandon, for that introduction and Ceres' leadership in convening CEVA. And thank you as well to my fellow panelists and We Mean Business Coalition and the Climate Group for the work you all are leading as well. So as Brandon mentioned, I'm Nate Lapides, UNFI's Senior Manager of Climate and Energy. I work on our sustainable operations team remotely out of the nation's capital. And in my role, I focus on operational efficiency. So primarily, I'm focused within our wholesale distribution network to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and operational expenses. My contribution to today's webinar on the next slide we'll include a brief background about UNFI, a description of our company's long road to our Gilroy, California electric vehicle project as a sort of mini case study, lessons learned to date, as well as a few recommendations that I hope will be beneficial to many. And I welcome questions or connections after this webinar to dive more deeply into anything I covered today. So first, a little bit about UNFI. We are a leading distributor of grocery and non-food products, and we also provide support services to retailers across the US and Canada. To give you all a sense of our scale, our last fiscal year, 2025, ended with over $32 billion in net sales of approximately 230,000 unique products by nearly 10,000 suppliers. So we're part of a vast wholesale grocery supply chain. Our fleet electrification strategy is focused on transitioning the assets, primarily serving outbound transportation activities, delivering to over 30,000 customer locations, which range from the largest grocers in the country to smaller and independent retailers as well. We have over 2,000 trucks in our commercial fleet and thousands more trailers. The vast majority of all these assets are powered by diesel through internal combustion engines used for vehicle propulsion or to run transportation refrigeration units, which are affixed to many of our trailers as we're distributing food. I also wanted to paint a picture of our typical duty cycle. A driver at one of our distribution centers would most typically operate a Class 8 heavy-duty vehicle, like you saw in my opening slide, to haul a refrigerated trailer. Now, that picture didn't have a trailer being hauled, but you can all imagine how large those are and how much payload they carry. They typically complete deliveries to multiple customers on a route and then return to base, meaning our distribution center, within a single shift. On the next slide, I want to highlight our most ambitious fleet electrification work to date, the Gilroy Electric Vehicle Blueprint and Infrastructure projects. But actually, before diving into that, I wanted to also call attention to the fact that we have experience piloting and also deploying zero emission and other electric powered TRUs, or transport refrigeration units, and other electric yard trucks across several distribution centers. There's so much focus on the challenge of on-road freight decarbonization, but it's also important to not lose sight of equipment like TRUs, which, by the way, are far more polluting than diesel engines and heavy-duty vehicles on a fuel consumed basis, at least, and other vehicles like yard trucks that make the potential for this total zero emissions logistics in our industry possible in the future. All that said, back to Gilroy and our road so far in that project. The journey began all the way back in 2020. I had to look this up. California Energy Commission, or CEC, had just announced a grant funding opportunity, which was titled Blueprints for Medium-Duty, Heavy-Duty, Zero-Emission Vehicle Infrastructure. UNFI applied, and in 2021, we received a grant to create our own blueprint. By 2023, we completed it and had identified, importantly, our Gilroy Distribution Center in California as a prime location to deploy EVs and infrastructure in the future, primarily because of our operations and the types of routes that we ran. So fast forward to 2024, the CEC followed up their earlier blueprint planning funding with another opportunity that would help bring projects identified to life. So by 25, we were able to pair a second grant from the CEC with funding from our local air district, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which would help offset significant additional capital expenses tied to the project we had begun to design. And we also enrolled in PG&E, our electric utility in this territory, their EV fleet program, which we were doing to seek their support and expertise, but also to get ahead of our project's future interconnection once we got to construction. In brief, our design includes EV charging and supporting infrastructure to transition our fleet of approximately 30 heavy-duty trucks to electric over the course of a few years. We'll also construct a rooftop solar array tied to a battery energy storage system, which will help us reduce operational costs further and provide us with additional flexibility for our operations. All that said, now here we are in the spring of 2026. I'm pleased to share that our project is moving forward. Of course, there have been significant market and policy volatility over the last year and a half that was mentioned earlier in this webinar. But I'll highlight that and some of our learnings along the way in my next and last slide. So I'll transition to a few of these high-level lessons and from our about 6 years in fleet electrification. And some of these do follow themes covered before that you may find in the reports from Ceres and We Mean Business. I'll try to give a little additional color, though, through our perspective, building our first charging depot. So the first is planning is absolutely critical. You could probably tell by the number of years we've been at this, but fleet electrification represents a major change to not just tech, but also to processes and functionality that can be incredibly valuable if you're strategic in the way you plan to leverage it. In our case, planning also helped us identify the right location to start our work and secure major public funding support through the CEC, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and our utility, PG&E, as mentioned. It's also incredibly important to be adaptable. So for us, regulations such as California's Advanced Clean Fleets were frankly pulled out from under us after we had committed significant time and resources. That said, the planning we did to establish our company's guiding climate targets and to acquire the funding and public support that I mentioned before was really important. Additionally, vehicle and supply chain technology is really changing rapidly. One of the best pieces of advice I can generically provide is that organizations should be open to as many charging approaches as possible. And you heard from AstraZeneca about this and Inspiration Mobility as well. And for us, this is still a bit of a concept. We have to do more work on it, but it means being open to transitioning our fleet using private infrastructure, such as what we're planning for Gilroy, California, all the way to a potential model where we would leverage public or some sort of semi-public infrastructure. And many of these projects are in development in parallel with ours or are already built as well. And another piece I want to point to on being adaptable and flexible is a learning from our work in Gilroy, which is that it's really important to design infrastructure, if it's going to serve your fleet primarily, that is built at least possible costs and with the greatest possibility to support flexibility if fleet operations, for example, shift. So one of our learnings is that this can be done through modular electrical engineering designs, partnering with whoever you're working with, as well as your electric utility to identify your service capacity that you may need in the future if you are to add more vehicles or have to change your operations in any meaningful way, which would require more power. And finally, I think this goes without saying, but it's really important to highlight this work is only possible in partnership with other experts. So very few fleets have the expertise necessary today, at least, to drive this transition alone. And even those that have developed internal expertise need strong partners to help them scale, as this work is meaningfully different from the way that we operate fossil fuel trucking, light duty fleets, et cetera. So with that, I thank everyone for your interest in our work and that of fellow panelists and hosts. I included my contact info here if anyone wants to connect after the webinar one-on-one, but I know we'll be transitioning to Q&A at this point. So I'll pass it over to Santeri to get us started on that.
Thank you so much, Nate. Such great presentations and very different views. So thanks also to Josh and Kristen for your presentations. So yeah, dear audience, please do drop your questions in the Q&A, and let us know if your question is directed to any specific presenter or a member of the panel. I will use my privilege as the moderator to present the first question. So I'd like to get each of the panelists' take on how long you've been deploying electric vehicles and chargers in your fleet operations, and over that time, what is one significant thing that you have seen change between then and now? And maybe we'll go in reverse order. Nate, maybe I'll ask you first. I think you mentioned that you started the project in 2020, right? So yeah, what have been the biggest changes between then and now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to be honest, a lot has changed since that date. But I think zooming out a little bit from our Gilroy project, what's been most evident of really recently, which is important to highlight, is that there was a point where we only thought that California was feasible, was viable for trucking electrification in our application. And again, despite some of the headwinds, there's been a lot that's shifted, and we have been able to electrify in other states. So between 2020 and now, and even in the past few years, we've deployed electric yard trucks in other states. Those pencil for us, and we've had a few deployments of electric trailers too. So I think the economics shifting dynamically is really something that is front and center nowadays, and will continue to shift, but has particularly shifted a lot in just the recent year.
Thanks for sharing that, Nate. Kristen, over to you. From your point of view, if you can reiterate how long the journey has been for you, and looking back, what do you think are the biggest changes since then?
Absolutely. We started probably in earnest in 2021. I think we had a few volunteers in 2020, but really our journey started in 2021. I think the biggest changes externally are kind of what I had mentioned, was just your access to longer range vehicles at an affordable price. So that is one thing. Manufacturers willing to work with you for incentives, where previously it was sort of hands off in some of those spaces. And then I also think the more you have a culture around something internally where this is part of our DNA, sustainability and values at AstraZeneca, I also think just the resistance has lessened, because it is now so well embedded from every sort of layer of the organization that if you want to work at AstraZeneca, this is a core part of our values, and this is how it works. So I would say that those are probably the two biggest changes.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and it's amazing. I think Josh shared some of the statistics of people who, once they get to drive an EV, most will not want to go back. But yeah, definitely what you also, Kristen, highlighted before about the change management is important. Josh, same question to you. When did you start, and what is the single biggest thing that has changed since you started?
Yeah, so we started the company at the beginning of 2021. So it's been 5 years now, and 5.5 years, and I would say that I would echo some of the things that both Chris and Nate mentioned in terms of just the proliferation of options. Right, when we started, there were very few electric vehicles out, and so you really had Teslas, and people were just introducing a few new passenger cars. There was no heavy duty, Class 8 trucks, very little medium duty. So now you can find quality EVs for pretty much every form factor and pretty much every class of vehicle. I think medium duty is still a little challenge, but new vehicles coming. The introduction of the Tesla Semi, which is happening right now, is a game changer for Class 8 tractors. I think the perception or really the reality on long haul and freight has been that the Class 8 electric tractors were just too expensive and didn't have the range. The Tesla Semi changes that dramatically. So I think that's something we're very excited about, which is a recent change, but really does change the game. I would say the second thing, in addition to now there being availability of vehicles at more affordable cost, is really just the ubiquitous data we now have on how EVs perform. So there are plenty of case studies and success areas where you can go and see and get the data on how EVs perform in a lot of different segments. And I think it's telling that when you look at certain emerging areas like autonomous vehicles, where those are probably the most highly utilized vehicles available. I mean, these vehicles are out on the road, 22 hours, 20 hours a day, minimal turns. I say this all the time, there really are no autonomous platforms that are not electric. They're choosing electric from the beginning because they're by far the most efficient vehicles to run. They have the lowest cost per mile. And when you're running a vehicle heavily, when there's very little downtime and you have high utilization, cost per mile is king. And so I think that's kind of an extreme example, but there's a lot of data now on where and how EVs outperform. And I think so that is de-risking, I think, adoption, because you have enough data and proof points to show and demonstrate where this is going to work.
Thanks, Josh. We have a question from the audience, and this is directed to anyone who's willing to pick it up. Do you have a master plan for connecting various parts of the US, and where do you see the most growth in? Are there corridors, for example, between states, I assume, where you expect to see the most growth? Anyone who wants to jump on that immediately?
I think it's applicable to us and our operations, certainly. We're working on our plans to expand. Like I said, a lot has shifted quickly. So many fleets like us are trying now to adapt, figure out what's next. Corridors are of interest to us. That's not in all cases our kind of business model, but leveraging corridor charging is something on our radar. So we've identified some hot states with, we think, favorable economics. More work to do to bring projects to life, but short answer is we're working on it. More to be done.
Thanks, Nate. How about Kristen? Did you see were some states easier to get started off than others?
The states were not. We hear this over and over again around kind of which states are the best places to start. We were challenged very much internally to start with certain states. The data was really an equalizer for us. So we were investing in putting chargers in people's homes. If they could do that, the public charging infrastructure was a little bit, less important. And the fact that our data kind of EV readiness score took into despite sort of your state, we took into account, hey, let's pretend it's going to be frigidly cold and the individual is going to leave their house and lose 25% range immediately, regardless of the state, or the opposite, right? Extreme heat or mountainous ranges that they're going over. So we took those into account right off the top. So again, those conversations around, well, I cannot be successful because I live here, we were able to demonstrate with data was just not a valid point. So we've got people in Montana, Wyoming, we've got, again, every corner, driving EVs. I don't know if that answers the question, but it is our experience.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you so much, Kristen. We have another question regarding, as companies start to accelerate their fleet electrification commitments, we start to see questions about strategic risk of supply chain concentration and the sort of transition dependent on manufacturing networks and geopolitical volatility. Josh, I wonder if you guys aggregate data from many different companies and discuss with many different companies. Is this a concern that you've started hearing and have you found ways to tackle that?
Candidly, not so much a concern that we hear. I mean, I do think there's been with EV availability, as I said in my presentation a little bit, certainly some OEMs have delayed models, some things have slowed down. Tariffs, have while they were here, I don't know today if they're here or not, but those caused some economic uncertainty. But I think back to the point about there being a pretty wide selection now of electric vehicles available. We have our customers, and on behalf of our customers, we really haven't had problems finding and securing the right electric vehicle for a use case at this point. And if anything, I think there are a lot of supply chain issues with, broadly with, they also pertain to ICE vehicles. I mean, you've seen certain companies having supply chain issues with all vehicles just to get aluminum, for example. And then certainly the current war in the Middle East highlights supply chain vulnerabilities in terms of fuel sources, right? And fossil fuel sources in particular, that I think has more recently increased interest again in EVs, even from a growing baseline, because domestically produced electricity just has a lot less volatility. And often you can hedge some of that volatility as well. So yeah, not something we've seen a lot of, but I don't know if AstraZeneca or UNFI have had that impact their operations in any way.
Yeah, anything to add, Nate or Kristen?
No, nothing really to add here.
Yeah.
Not
Nate?
much for us either, but I think it's a good topic to have in mind, right? We're going to be 30 trucks, or just over 30 trucks out of a few thousand. So there's a ways to go, and it's a fair consideration as we scale.
Naturally. Thank you very much. We're almost at time, so I'd like to wrap things up. Firstly, thank you to our amazing company representatives. A couple of points I wanted to highlight. As Josh said, every fleet can get started, even if not all fleets can fully electrify today. So the biggest barrier is fleet inertia. So definitely get started today. Reach out to any of us if you have any questions. Thanks also, Kristen, for sharing AstraZeneca's journey. My key takeaway from that was the importance of data-driven decision making and change management, as with any change. And thank you very much, Nate, for also sort of tooting the horn of heavy-duty vehicle fleets, including the often forgotten off-road vehicles that are as important as road vehicles, and really appreciate having a depot perspective as well in the panel. So great to hear that you were able to find supportive state policies as well, because those can be a really big help when transitioning fleets. So yeah, really to say conceptions of EV transition get outdated real quick with how fast battery prices are coming down. So my advice to everyone is to get started today and reach out to us if you need any help. Huge thanks also to colleagues from Ceres and Climate Group for making this webinar happen. And thank you to our virtual audience, both live and watching this recording later on. As mentioned, the recording will be shared after the webinar. So on behalf of myself, thank you very much, everyone, and wishing everyone a great day ahead.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.